A racist cop humiliated a black royal guard, thinking he was just another man to disrespect. But when the world found out who he really was, the backlash was unforgettable, and what happened next will stay with you forever. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm golden hue over the streets of downtown London. Tourists bustled around, snapping pictures and marveling at the city's historic landmarks. Among them, in his distinguished red uniform and bearskin hat, stood Darnell Hayes, a black royal guard. His presence was commanding, his posture rigid and proud as he carried out his duty. A symbol of tradition, honor, and service to the crown, Darnell had spent years training for this role. It wasn't just a job, it was a badge of honor, a position that carried deep respect and responsibility. But as much as he had achieved, Darnell knew that not everyone saw him for who he was. On this particular day, that harsh reality would unfold in a way he could have never imagined. It began when his shift ended, and he changed out of his ceremonial uniform, blending into the crowd in simple, casual clothing. The streets were alive with chatter and the smell of street food. Darnell, a man who carried his pride quietly, stopped to help a young child who had dropped a toy into the street. He handed it back with a gentle smile, earning a quick "thank you" from the child's parent before he moved on. Just as he was about to cross the street, a police car screeched to a halt beside him, the blue lights flashing against the reflective windows of nearby buildings. Darnell instinctively paused, confused. He hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't even spoken to anyone other than the child just moments earlier. "Hey, you! Hands where I can see them!" barked an officer stepping out of the car. He was a tall, broad man in his mid-40s, with a sharp jawline and a scowl that seemed permanently etched onto his face. His badge glinted in the fading light. Darnell complied immediately, raising his hands slowly. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked calmly, his voice steady but tinged with confusion. "You tell me," the officer snapped, eyeing him up and down. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Empty your pockets." A small crowd began to gather at a distance, their murmurs carrying over the street. Darnell frowned, his confusion turning to unease. He was dressed plainly, carrying nothing suspicious, yet he felt the heat of judgment radiating from the officer's piercing glare. "I'm not sure what description you're talking about, but I'm just on my way home," Darnell replied, keeping his tone measured. The officer stepped closer, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "Don't get smart with me, boy," he spat, his words dripping with venom. At that moment, something inside Darnell shifted. He was no stranger to this tone, the assumption of guilt, the dehumanizing language. He had faced racism before, subtle and overt. But standing here in the middle of the street, being reduced to boy, he felt the weight of every unjust moment pressing down on him. "I'll show you my ID," Darnell said calmly, reaching for his pocket. But before he could take it out, the officer grabbed his wrist roughly, yanking him forward. "I said hands where I can see them." Gasps rippled through the small crowd as the officer forcefully pressed Darnell against the hood of the police car. "You're under arrest," the officer said coldly. "For what?" Darnell managed to say, his voice muffled against the cold metal of the car. "For resisting and failure to comply," the officer barked. "Resisting?" someone in the crowd echoed. "He didn't do anything." The murmurs grew louder as more people stopped to watch the scene. Phones began to appear, recording the interaction. Darnell's heart raced as he felt the crushing weight of the officer's hand pinning him down. He wanted to explain, to say something, but he knew any sudden movement might escalate the situation. And then it happened. The officer leaned down, close to Darnell's ear, and said with a sneer, "You think you're special? You're nothing but another thug." Those words hit harder than the officer's grip. Darnell closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in defeat, but in restraint. He thought of the Royal Guard uniform that hung neatly in his locker just a few miles away. He thought of the pride he carried for his service, the sacrifices he had made to earn his position. The crowd's voices grew louder, their anger palpable. "He didn't do anything wrong," shouted one man. "This is racism," yelled a woman from across the street. Darnell's voice finally broke through. "Check my ID." he said firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You'll see who I am." But the officer wasn't listening. He cuffed Darnell's hands behind his back and shoved him into the back seat of the car. As the car pulled away, the crowd's outrage spilled into the streets. "This is disgusting," someone shouted. A young woman with a phone in her hand turned to her friend. "Did you see how he just assumed? He didn't even check his ID." But little did the officer know the truth about Darnell's identity, and the storm it was about to unleash, was something no one could have prepared for. As the police car sped through the streets, Darnell sat silently in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him. The leather interior of the car felt suffocating. The officer's smug voice on the radio cutting through the tense silence. "Got the suspect detained," the officer reported. Darnell didn't bother speaking up. He knew anything he said at this moment would be dismissed. He wasn't just fighting an arrest. He was fighting the officer's preconceived notions of who he was. The car came to a stop outside the precinct, a building whose walls seemed to radiate indifference. The officer yanked the door open and roughly pulled Darnell out, his firm grip digging into his arm. The other officers milling around outside barely glanced in their direction. To them, this was routine. Another arrest, another statistic. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as Darnell was led to the booking desk. The officer shoved him forward. "Name?" the desk sergeant barked without looking up. "Darnell Hayes," Darnell replied, his voice steady but laced with quiet anger. The officer behind him scoffed. "Don't bother playing innocent, Hayes. Let's see what your ID says." Darnell turned his head slightly, meeting the officer's gaze. "Yes, let's." The officer reached into Darnell's pocket and pulled out his wallet, rifling through it until he found the small, stiff card. He flipped it open casually, expecting the usual. A standard ID, maybe a few credit cards. But what he saw made his jaw tighten. The room seemed to pause for a moment as the officer stared at the ID in disbelief. Embossed with gold trim and stamped with an official royal seal, the card identified Darnell Hayes as an active member of the Queen's Royal Guard. What is this?" the officer stammered, his arrogance faltering. "It's my identification," Darnell said plainly, his tone sharper now. "You would have known that if you'd taken 2 seconds to ask before pinning me to the hood of your car." The desk sergeant, who had barely glanced up earlier, suddenly stood, his eyes wide as he took the ID from the officer. "Royal Guard," he muttered, disbelief evident in his voice. "Is this for real?" "Call and verify it," Darnell replied, his voice calm but firm. "And when you do, I'd like my handcuffs removed." The officer, now visibly shaken, turned to the sergeant. It could be fake. You know how they what?" Darnell interjected, cutting him off sharply. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. The sergeant picked up the phone, his hands trembling slightly as he dialed. Moments later, the confirmation came. "Yes, he's a member of the Queen's Guard," the voice on the other end said. "And if he's in your station, you'd better have a damn good reason why." The sergeant hung up the phone and looked at Darnell, his face pale. "Release him," he said quietly. The officer who had arrested Darnell fumbled with the cuffs, his demeanor shifting from cocky to awkwardly apologetic. "Look, I didn't know. You didn't care," Darnell replied, his voice steady but cold. He rubbed his wrists where the cuffs had dug into his skin and stepped forward, his commanding presence filling the room. "You assumed. You saw my skin, and you made up your mind about who I was. That's all you needed to see." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Around the precinct, other officers stood frozen, their eyes darting between Darnell and the officer who had made the arrest. Before Darnell could walk away, the sergeant stepped forward, his voice tense. "Mr. Hayes, I'd like to apologize on behalf of the department. This isn't how we operate." "Isn't it?" Darnell replied, turning to face him. "Because what happened to me out there didn't feel like an isolated incident. It felt like a pattern, one I've seen before, and one that I know I'm not the only one to experience." His words hung in the air, the weight of their truth sinking in. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. As Darnell walked out of the precinct, his head held high, He noticed the crowd that had gathered outside. The videos taken during his arrest had gone viral in real time, and the world was already reacting. Cheers erupted as he emerged, free of the cuffs that had bound him. Strangers approached him, their voices filled with emotion. "We saw what happened," one man shouted. "It's disgusting how they treated you." "You didn't deserve that," cried a woman, her phone still recording. Darnell didn't stop to speak to the crowd, but he felt their support like a wave behind him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was bigger than one man or one arrest. What happened next, however, would take even Darnell by surprise. Darnell stood outside the precinct, the weight of the crowd's energy pressing around him. Cameras and phones were everywhere, their lenses fixed on him like beacons of light in a dark moment. He had wanted nothing more than to quietly return home after a long shift. But the humiliation he'd endured had now become a public spectacle. A reporter pushed through the crowd, microphone in hand. "Mr. Hayes, is it true you're part of the Queen's Royal Guard? How does it feel to be treated this way despite your position?" Darnell turned to her, his face calm but his eyes fierce. "It doesn't matter what position I hold," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "What matters is that this could have happened to anyone who looks like me. I wasn't seen as a guard, a citizen, or even a human being. I was seen as a target." The crowd roared in agreement, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. Meanwhile, inside the precinct, the officers who had watched Darnell's arrest unfold on the street were now glued to their phones, scrolling through social media. The video of Darnell's arrest was everywhere, shared thousands of times with hashtags like #Justice for Darnell and #Royal Racism. "Did you see this?" one officer muttered, holding up his phone to another. The video showed the exact moment the arresting officer pressed Darnell against the car, followed by the sneer in his voice when he said, "You're nothing but another thug." The comments were brutal. How do you arrest someone without even checking ID first? Imagine humiliating a member of the Queen's Guard. Racism in plain sight. This isn't just about him. This is about all of us who've been treated like this. The desk sergeant stormed into the room. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered, his face tight with worry. "We need to get ahead of this." But outside, the storm had already begun. News crews arrived within minutes, their trucks lining the street like vultures circling prey. Protesters appeared just as quickly, holding signs that read, "Respect our dignity," and "End racial profiling." Darnell had been standing on the sidewalk, quietly observing the chaos, when a young boy tugged at his sleeve. The boy, no older than 10, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are you really a royal guard?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am," Darnell replied, kneeling down to meet the boy's gaze. "Doesn't the Queen care about you?" the boy asked innocently. Darnell froze for a moment, the child's question striking deeper than he expected. "I believe she does," he said finally. "But it's not just about me. It's about making sure people like you never have to feel the way I did today." At that moment, a voice boomed from a loudspeaker. "Move back." It was the police, trying to control the growing crowd. Protesters chanted louder in response, their voices merging into a single powerful roar. Dignity, respect, justice. The officer who had arrested Darnell, now standing behind the barricades, watched the scene unfold with visible discomfort. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't thought beyond the moment he placed those cuffs on Darnell. Now, the weight of his actions loomed large, and he could feel the eyes of his peers burning into him. As the hours passed, the video spread beyond London, capturing international attention. News anchors discussed the incident with visible outrage. A member of the Queen's Royal Guard, treated like a criminal simply because of the colour of his skin. This isn't just a London issue. This is a global one. How many more people face this type of injustice every day? Celebrities and public figures joined the conversation, voicing their anger online. Statements poured in. Darnell Hayes deserves respect, not because he's a royal guard, but because he's a human being. Racism doesn't care about titles. It's time for change. Even members of Parliament weighed in, calling for an investigation into the arrest and demanding accountability from the department. Back at Darnell's small apartment, he finally had a moment to himself. He sat on his worn couch, his phone buzzing incessantly with notifications. Texts from friends and family flooded in, offering their support. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, words she'd often said when he faced challenges growing up. "Darnell, you've got to stand tall, even when the world tries to knock you down." He glanced at his phone again, scrolling through the messages and comments. Amid the chaos, one stood out. "You showed us what dignity looks like in the face of hate. Thank you for being strong when so many of us feel powerless." Darnell set the phone down, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about him anymore. The world was watching, and he had a responsibility to use this moment to demand better, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been in his shoes. The next morning, the city woke up to headlines plastered across every screen and newspaper. Royal Guard arrest sparks international outrage. Racism caught on camera. The unjust arrest of Darnell Hayes. How a racist cop's actions ignited a global movement. The streets outside the precinct were flooded with protesters holding signs, chanting for justice. The police department was under immense pressure, and inside the precinct, tensions were boiling over. "Do you realize what you've done?" barked the captain, pacing in front of the arresting officer. "This isn't just a local issue anymore. It's on every major news outlet, for God's sake." The officer, now visibly nervous, stammered. I didn't know he was part of the Royal Guard." "That's your defense?" the captain snapped. "You didn't know? What about the fact that he's a human being? You didn't bother to ask questions. You didn't check his ID. You assumed." The room fell silent. The officer looked down, but the damage was already done. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, the incident had reached the ears of the royal family. Discussions began behind closed doors, and soon an official statement was released. The actions taken against Darnell Hayes, a loyal member of the Queen's Royal Guard, were deeply troubling. The Crown stands against all forms of racism and injustice. We have full confidence that the truth will prevail and accountability will be enforced. The statement was brief, but powerful, and its release sent shockwaves through the nation. It was rare for the royal family to directly address such matters, but this time, the situation demanded it. At the same time, Darnell was being approached by activists, community leaders, and even lawyers, all urging him to take legal action. He had remained quiet since the arrest, carefully considering his next steps. In a small conference room at a community center, Darnell met with a group of organizers. One of them, an older woman named Mrs. Blake, spoke with conviction. "Darnell, this isn't just about you anymore. What happened to you is happening to so many others who don't have a platform. But you have the world's attention right now. We need to use this moment to demand real change." Darnell nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "But this can't just be about calling out one bad cop. The whole system needs to change. This is bigger than me." 2 days later, Darnell stood in front of a podium at a public rally. Thousands of people had gathered in the square, holding signs and chanting. As he stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. "Thank you for being here," Darnell began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I never wanted to be the center of attention. I never wanted my name to be attached to something like this. But here we are, because of what happened to me, and what has happened to so many others." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I've spent my life serving this country, wearing the uniform of the Queen's Royal Guard with pride. But none of that mattered the moment I was seen as less than human. That's the reality we're fighting against." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Darnell raised his hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about one cop, one arrest, or even one institution. It's about all of us standing together and saying enough is enough. We deserve better. Our children deserve better. And we're not stopping until we see real change." The rally sparked a movement. Calls for reforms in law enforcement echoed across the nation, from new training policies to accountability measures. Petitions circulated demanding that the officer involved be fired, and that investigations into racial profiling be conducted. The officers' department released a statement acknowledging the incident and promising an internal review. However, public trust in their promises was thin. For Darnell, the days that followed were overwhelming. He was invited to interviews, asked to speak at events, and inundated with messages of support. But what stayed with him most were the personal stories people shared. A young man approached him after one event and said, "What happened to you? It's happened to me too. But seeing you stand tall makes me believe we can fight back." In the midst of the chaos, Darnell returned to a familiar place, the barracks where he had trained to become a Royal Guard. As he walked through the corridors, he was met with nods of respect from his fellow guards. His commanding officer, an older man with sharp eyes, approached him. "Darnell," he said, his voice warm, "you've always represented this institution with honor. But what you're doing now, it's bigger than the Guard. It's about justice. And I want you to know, we stand with you." Darnell felt a wave of emotion rise in his chest, but managed a firm nod. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. As he left the barracks, Darnell looked out over the city. He had never intended to become a symbol of change, but the moment had found him. And as difficult as it was, he knew he couldn't walk away. The storm was far from over, but Darnell Hayes was ready to face it, standing tall, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. The movement sparked by Darnell's arrest grew into something bigger than anyone had imagined. What began as a local incident became a global conversation about systemic racism, justice, and accountability. Protests continued across the city and beyond, with people of all backgrounds standing together, chanting for change. Meanwhile, the police department faced increasing scrutiny. Internal investigations into the arresting officer revealed a history of complaints, most of which had been quietly dismissed. Public pressure mounted, demanding not only his dismissal, but also accountability for the department's failure to act sooner. 1 week after the rally, Darnell received a call from the head of the Police Oversight Committee. "Mr. Hayes," the voice on the other end said, "we've reviewed the case thoroughly. The officer responsible for your arrest has been terminated, effective immediately. We've also launched a broader inquiry into racial bias within the department." Darnell listened quietly, his emotions a mix of relief and resolve. "Thank you for informing me," he replied. "But this isn't the end. This can't just stop with one officer losing his job." "We understand," the caller said, "and we're working to implement real reforms. We'd like to invite you to be part of those discussions." The invitation marked a turning point for Darnell. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a voice for change. Over the following weeks, he sat in meetings with lawmakers, activists, and police officials, helping to shape policies aimed at addressing racial profiling and building trust between law enforcement and communities of color. "I never thought I'd be sitting at a table like this," Darnell admitted during one meeting. "But if my experience can prevent even one person from going through what I did, then it's worth it." Outside the boardrooms, Darnell's story continued to resonate with people around the world. Messages poured in from individuals who had faced similar injustices but never had the platform to speak out. One letter in particular stood out, a heartfelt note from a mother whose teenage son had been wrongfully arrested. "Mr. Hayes," the letter read, "thank you for standing up when so many of us couldn't. My son saw your story and told me, if he can fight back, so can I. You've given us hope." Darnell folded the letter carefully, his eyes misting. For all the noise, the protests, and the media attention, it was these quiet moments of connection that meant the most to him. Months later, the world seemed to pause once again as Darnell stood at a podium outside Buckingham Palace. The Queen herself had requested his presence to publicly recognize his service and resilience. Dressed in his ceremonial uniform, he looked out at the crowd, a sea of faces filled with pride and admiration. Beside him stood members of the royal family, including the Queen, who addressed the nation. Today, we honor a man who has served not only this institution, but the principles of justice and equality, she said. Mr. Hayes, your courage and dignity have reminded us all of the importance of standing against prejudice in all its forms. As she pinned a medal of commendation to his chest, the crowd erupted into applause. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment for history. Later that evening, as Darnell walked home, still wearing his uniform, he stopped by a quiet park. Sitting on a bench, he watched children play, their laughter filling the air. A young boy ran up to him, wide-eyed and curious. "Are you the royal guard everyone's been talking about?" the boy asked shyly. Darnell smiled. "I am." The boy beamed. "My mom said you're really brave." "Your mom's right," Darnell said gently, kneeling to meet the boy's gaze. "But being brave isn't about wearing a uniform or standing in front of a crowd. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." The boy nodded solemnly before running back to join his friends. As Darnell sat there, the weight of the past few months began to lift. He thought of the anger, the humiliation, the outpouring of support, and the changes that had begun to take shape. His journey wasn't over, but in that moment, he felt a sense of peace. The world had seen him humiliated, but they had also seen him rise. And now, Darnell Hayes wasn't just a royal guard. He was a symbol of dignity, resilience, and the power of standing tall in the face of injustice. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city. Darnell stood, his medal gleaming in the fading light, ready to continue his journey, not just as a royal guard, but as a champion for change.